The Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, or good afternoon. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today for a hearing entitled Development Assistance During Conflict, Lessons from Afghanistan. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. And please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with remote committee proceedings of HRES 8, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Again, thank you all for joining us for today's hearing on Afghanistan, and specifically the lessons that our experiences there hold for our nation's development programs. Like many Americans, I reacted to the events of August of this year with sorrow. As the Taliban moved into city after city over the course of 2 weeks, the Afghan government's forces melted away, often without a fight, and its leaders fled into the wilderness or to another country. Within 2 weeks, millions of Afghans found their lives fundamentally changed and have been forced to navigate a new reality. They were promised a different life by their leaders, by the United States, and by the international community. The gap between that promise and the reality they now face is why I reacted with sorrow, but not necessarily with surprise. The seeds of the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and military weren't sown by any single decision the Biden administration made since taking office. It was the product of a failure of the Afghan people to build a durable government and military over 20 years, and yes, the failure of the United States and the international community to help them do that. Over the last 2 decades, the United States spent over $1 trillion, including almost $150 billion in Afghan reconstruction and related activities. Our allies and partners spent billions more. Through 2 decades, measures of success constantly changed, and successes were quickly followed by setbacks. Corruption and waste by the Afghan government, its military, and too often by U.S. contractors followed that money. There's no doubt that in many ways, the lives of Afghans were improved over 2 decades. Poverty was down, health outcomes were better, and education was more widely available. But these successes were built on top of an unsustainable model that is collapsing as we speak. I call this hearing because the Congress and this committee need to take account of how we got here and look at what lessons that holds for U.S. development priorities in other areas of conflict, and even in Afghanistan itself. The last time the Special Inspector General was in front of this committee to speak to lessons learned, the hope was that what we learned would help us course correct in Afghanistan. The context of the conversation is very different today. There's no U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and international development, where it occurs, will have to navigate a maze of legal challenges, sanctions, and unsavory actors. A lot of the discussion in recent weeks has been how the lack of a U.S. presence on the ground will require the military to conduct, quote, over-the-horizon airstrikes against military targets, often with uncertain intelligence. We'll need to similarly adopt to a world of over-the-horizon international development, relying on multilateral organizations and other trusted partners to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan. This is an entirely different set of challenges that we face. We cannot course correct anymore, but we can apply the lessons learned to development work in other conflict zones, whether that's Somalia, Syria, Libya, or the Sahel. The challenges may not be at the same scale as Afghanistan, but there are real commonalities that these experiences can inform. The United States government also has a critical tool to do development in conflict zones, the Global Fragility Act, bipartisan legislation that was signed into law in 2019. This legislation aims to reduce violent conflict and structure how we work with fragile states. The bill's genesis was informed in many ways by the U.S. experience in Afghanistan, and I hope that its implementation, which we're working with the administration on now, will be informed by those experiences as well. I'm looking forward to the testimony today so that we can develop a better record of the decision over the 2 decades that led to the failure of the Afghan government to withstand the Taliban offensive. And with that, I'll now turn it over to Ranking Member Malliotakis for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Castro, for calling this important hearing to discuss the U.S. development assistance in Afghanistan. It is my hope that the committee continues holding hearings to discuss what went disastrously wrong with the U.S. withdrawal and what the future implications are for U.S. national security. Almost $145 billion has been appropriated for Afghanistan relief and reconstruction since 2002. And while many important gains were made during these years to support the people of Afghanistan, especially to advance the rights of women and children, increasing their access to education and supporting civil society, there were also failures impossible to miss. The series of reports released by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction on lessons learned from our 20-year mission offers important takeaways. In the aftermath of the botched withdrawal, however, we do need to seriously question why the Biden administration did not heed those lessons. And we need to ask why, even now, our priorities seem to be misplaced. Today, it's clear what our number one priority should be ensuring the safety and security of U.S. citizens, our lawful permanent residents, the civs, and at-risk Afghans who supported U.S. policy objectives over the last 20 years and now whose lives are in danger. In this vein, we must continue to focus our tax dollars on counterterrorism, especially in the light of recent intelligence reports which indicate that Al-Qaeda could reemerge in 1 to 2 years in Afghanistan, notwithstanding the proven and deadly threat of ISIS-K. Despite what Secretary Blinken stated before our committee last month, we can in no way trust the Taliban, a terrorist organization itself, to ensure that Afghanistan does not become a hotbed for violent extremism. So far, however, the administration seems content with pursuing priorities other than national security. For example, I'm deeply concerned about premature conversations by the Biden administration to restart U.S. non-humanitarian aid programs. Not only do key questions remain about the makeup and structure of the Taliban-controlled government of Afghanistan, but in addition to our citizens left behind, there are still U.S. implementing partners trying to get their staff out of the country. Here's the number the administration doesn't like to cite. Over 10,000 current and former U.S. aid partner staff are still asking for help to be evacuated. These are men and women that have worked alongside us for over 20 years, implementing programs to advance critical stabilization and recovery priorities. Getting these people to safety needs to be this administration's priority. We need to show up for partners that risk their own personal safety to implement U.S.-funded programs. And frankly, the lack of urgency to address this critical issue is astounding. We cannot afford to take any action, including resuming non-humanitarian assistance programs that would legitimize the Taliban-controlled government of Afghanistan. One consequence of the withdrawal of the U.S. forces and diplomats that's not being discussed enough is the limitations on our ability to effectively monitor and implement U.S. assistance programs. We have seen the destructive role that the Taliban plays in provision of assistance before, from dictating NGO operations to excluding women and children from participating in programs. Over 18 million Afghan civilians, nearly half the population, are in dire need of humanitarian assistance after the disastrous collapse of the country, the subsequent severe economic downturn, and the rapidly approaching winter months. There is a clear need here, but with the Taliban in full control, options are extremely limited. Because, to be clear, we must not take any step to enable or provide any more leverage to the Taliban government sitting in Kabul, and we must be sure that not a single U.S. tax dollar ends up in their hands. So I hope that the Inspector General sheds light on how ongoing aid programs in other security restrictive environments like Yemen, Somalia, Syria, and Iraq could inform the risks and safeguards necessary for current and future assistance programs in Afghanistan. Mr. Sapko, I really look forward to your testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And before I introduce our distinguished witness, I want to ask unanimous consent that Representative Meyer be allowed to join this committee and ask questions following all the other subcommittee members. Without objection, we'll allow Rep. Meyer to join. And now I want to introduce our witness. We have with us today the Honorable John F. Sopko, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. Mr. Sopko has been in this position since 2012 and has seen the situation in Afghanistan change significantly over the last decade. Thank you for joining us here today to speak about your work, your findings, and help Congress chart a path forward. I'll now recognize Mr. Sopko for 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statement will be made part of the record, Mr. Sopko. Please.
Thank you very much. Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Malliotakis, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. Without a doubt, our country's experience in Afghanistan has been costly. It lasted over 20 years. We spent over $145 billion on reconstruction, and we cannot forget that more than 2,400 Americans paid the ultimate price in defense of liberty in Afghanistan. Additionally, over 21,000 of our troops were wounded and continue to bear the scars of conflict. These are sobering numbers, and we owe all who served in Afghanistan, as well as the long-suffering American taxpayer, an accurate accounting of what worked and what did not work in that country. Since Congress established SIGAR in 2008, we have publicly issued over 600 audits and other reports, including 11 lessons learned reports, in an attempt to do just that. Our work demonstrates that no single policy decision nor administration led to the failure of our reconstruction effort. Rather, it was a series of decisions made over 2 decades that led us to this point. The seeds of the collapse in Afghanistan were sown well before the last 60 days. But the questions now are, what could we have done differently, and what must we prepare to do differently in the future? For the sake of brevity, let me highlight just 3 key areas from our reports for your consideration. First, the U.S. government's inability to get the right people into the right jobs at the right time was one of the reconstruction mission's most significant failure. While the State Department has statutory authority, for example, to lead security sector assistance efforts overseas, it does not have the personnel, expertise, or resources to do so. This left the Defense Department to fill that void, resulting in less qualified and poorly trained personnel undertaking key diplomatic and development roles. Additionally, state and USAID experienced frequent staff turnovers in Afghanistan of a year or even less service there, leaving their successors to start from scratch and make similar mistakes all over again. Secondly, U.S. government agencies, including state and aid, rarely conducted sufficient monitoring and evaluation, or M&E as we call it, to understand the impacts of their development efforts. The absence of periodic reality checks created the risk of doing the wrong thing perfectly. By that I mean a project that completed required tasks would be required successful, even though it did not achieve or contributed to broader, more important goals. If better monitoring and evaluation processes had been in place to evaluate programs to combat corruption, develop the economy, build the Afghan security forces, many of the problems that contributed to the rapid collapse of the Afghan state could have been corrected. Measuring success by focusing on dollars and cents is no substitute for common sense. Thirdly, and probably more importantly, the U.S. government did not understand the Afghan political and cultural context, thereby leading to empowering corrupt power brokers and politicians, forcing inappropriate Western technocratic models on Afghan institutions, imposing formal Western rule of law on a country that addressed most disputes through informal means and struggling to understand and mitigate cultural barriers to supporting women and girls. This failure meant projects intended to mitigate conflict often exacerbated it. To be sure, state and aid had successes, but their sustainability of those gains is obviously now in grave doubt. Now, the book on Afghanistan is not yet closed. Questions remain unanswered. Questions that SIGAR has been tasked by Congress to investigate, including the sudden collapse of the Afghan government and security forces. At the request of your colleague, Chairman Barra, we will also be conducting an audit of the Special Immigrant Visa Program. I look forward to working with this subcommittee and members as we undertake these efforts, and I look forward to answering all the questions you have today.
Well, thank you for your testimony, Mr. Sopko, and I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each. And pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll now recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between majority and the minority. And I can only call on you if you're present with your video on. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. And I'll start by recognizing myself for the first question. One common thread across SIGAR's work is how the Department of Defense, given reconstruction responsibilities that it was ill-suited for that task because it had the resources to do it, but the State Department and USAID may have been able to do those things better. I asked you about this issue when you last testified in front of the committee in January of last year, and one of the takeaways was to increase staffing and presence of diplomats in the field. But much of this is the product of how Washington decisions are made. The Biden administration has given the USAID administrator a seat on the National Security Council, which is a first. And this can balance some of the discussions at the interagency and is a welcome recognition of the role development can play in advancing our national security. Can you speak to how the DoD was able to crowd out state or USAID in Afghanistan? And what more can be done to ensure that critical voices are not left out of the conversation when discussing these issues?
DOD didn't crowd them out for nefarious reasons. It was just, I think, the reality of the situation. Their funding overwhelmed state and aid. They also had the capability to get into areas that were not safe. And that's another problem you have to realize. You know, some State Department and aid officials jokingly said we were out PowerPointed. You talk about some of the meetings and organizations that were set up in which there was supposed to be equal membership from state, aid, and DOD, and maybe there'd be one person from aid and one person from state and 20 people from DOD. That is a particular problem. It's enhanced in Afghanistan because we wanted fast results, quick results. And I think there was a frustration expressed by DOD that state and aid and regular development, and we all know, and you particularly on the committee should realize that development takes time. You can't do development or reconstruction in months or even half a year or a year. It takes time. And what happened is DOD was given the reins to do a lot of the development aid and didn't know how to do it, didn't have the capability, didn't have the expertise, and that's particularly a problem. It's a problem basically of funding. We tend to view more bodies in state and aid as a waste of money, but we don't if we're talking about the Defense Department. And I think until we get over that and realize state and aid have important missions, they have to be fully funded.
All right, no, thank you. In your most recent report, you note that contractors were often used to travel to places that were deemed too dangerous for U.S. government employees. This made the U.S. government dependent on contractors to do oversight of projects, which meant there was little to no actual oversight over the projects. This problem of U.S. personnel being stuck in embassies and unable to get into the field is, of course, not unique to Afghanistan. But as we explore doing development in other conflict zones, how can the United States ensure that diplomatic and development personnel are able to get out into the field in the same way that contractors are?
I think Congress, the ultimate thing is Congress, the American people, and the administration, whoever's in the White House, Democrat or Republican, has to realize that diplomacy is never going to be totally risk-free. We expect and we understand when DOD takes calculated risks. There has been a tendency, and I saw this over time in Afghanistan, a fear among State Department officials and aid officials to take risk. As a result, people didn't leave the compounds, people didn't go over the wire and do work they need to do. And I think it's because they were afraid they would get in trouble if somebody got hurt. I'm not talking about recklessness. I'm talking about there are State Department, if you talk to the average State Department official or aid official, they understand they have to take risks. You have to let them take those calculated risks. Then we don't have to worry about contractors doing their job or worry about DOD doing the job. I think it's the approach we have to risk taking in the diplomatic field. We have to resolve that.
No, well, thank you, sir. And I want to pass it over to the ranking member for her questions.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate what you're saying here today, and it seems that this is an issue where I think Republicans and Democrats can certainly agree. We want to make sure that the taxpayer money is being used properly. I have a question relating to, can we, or if we can, how can we ensure that this money does not get into Taliban hands?
Well, currently, all funding, except I think a very small amount of humanitarian aid, has been stopped. So it's not getting into Taliban hands. But if the spigot is open, I'm sorry?
Yeah. No, sorry, please continue.
Yeah. If the spigot is opened, it's going to be difficult to do it, far more difficult because we don't have people on the ground. There are ways to look at it, but the first thing we should consider is we should put conditions on it to make certain we have access, whether it's SIGAR or somebody else has access to books and records and remotely can monitor how it's being done. It's going to be extremely difficult. We had problems monitoring it even with a friendly, although incompetent Afghan and corrupt Afghan government. We will definitely have more problems, but you have to put those conditions on it, and you have to enforce the conditions. And we do not have a good track record on that. And we've highlighted that over the years. We did not really put strong conditions and hold the Afghans' feet to the fire on that. And I hope we've learned from that, and we realize if we give money to the Taliban, we're going to have to try to watch how the money's being spent.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and that is why I pause when we are having this discussion about sending more money. As Inspector General, what kind of fraud have you seen? You've talked about waste. We know that there's been tons of waste. Any particular egregious examples of fraud that you can point to?
Oh, we saw it everywhere. I mean, probably the biggest and most talked about are the ghosts. Ghost soldiers, ghost police we saw over there, where the Afghan government was created out of whole cloth individuals that didn't exist. We ended up paying the salaries. We ended up not only paying the salaries, but we paid everything that went to supporting a soldier or a policeman. Likewise, the international bodies, and I know this subcommittee has jurisdiction over international organizations. We found the same problem with international organizations, where they were paying salaries or paying for things, and they didn't monitor or evaluate. And this in particular was very difficult for us because a lot of the international organizations wouldn't let us in to take a look at the books and records. So we saw that a lot. Fuel disappearing. Over 50% of the fuel we bought for the Afghan government, for their police, their soldiers, and for the government itself was stolen. 50%.
Wow.
And we had a wonderful case that I gave to President Ghani shortly after he was inaugurated. He said he was going to do something about it, where we saw price fixing to the tune of costing the U.S. taxpayer over $250 million extra on $1 billion contract. He never did a thing on it, nor did his attorney general, nor did anyone else.
The
So for
same,
the whole time,
the same
Yes.
President Ghani who fled with $169 million, as was reported by the BBC and other outlets.
Well, we haven't proven that yet. We're looking into that. Actually, the committee, Oversight and Government Reform Committee, has asked us to look into that. But there are allegations, but not only with President Ghani. There are allegations with senior officials in their finance ministry, their central bank, and a number of other ministries walking off with millions of dollars. But again, those are just allegations.
Yes.
We have not confirmed any of those yet.
No, I appreciate that. What metrics can Congress put in place to ensure that the money's being spent appropriately, but also that they're getting the intended results along the way, so that way programs can be cut off or money can be diverted if we're not seeing intended results? Do you have any recommendations?
Well, we issued an entire report on that, and I don't think we have enough time in 23 seconds, but the monitoring and evaluation report that we issued earlier this year, I would highly recommend taking a look at that. We talk about the need for effective monitoring and evaluation, and it's got to be realistic, and you got to look at what the end result. We're pretty good at doing inputs and outputs, but never looking at the outcomes. And you have to hold state, aid, and DOD to having met the outcomes that they tell you they're supposed to result in. And if you don't, that's the biggest problem we saw. The ultimate monitoring and evaluation that was done in Afghanistan was at the end, because they falsified or ignored all the bad results on M&E for the years and years that we've been raising concerns. And the ultimate M&E, the ultimate monitoring and evaluation was, could the Afghan government stand on its own? And we saw what the results were. If we had had effective monitoring and evaluation, if we had actually held their feet to the fire over the last 10 years, I say we wouldn't have ended up where we are today with a non-existent Afghan government.
Thank you. And if it's happening there, it's happening in Yemen and Syria and Iraq, potentially in other countries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's not my job to look at those other countries, but
Sure.
I think take our report, and we have briefed state and aid on this, and I must say they are listening now, and take our report and see if they're doing it in these other countries. You raise an excellent point, ma'am.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll go to the Vice Chair of the committee, Sarah Jacobs.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Inspector General Sopko, for being here and for all of your work over the years to make sure that we tried to learn some of these lessons in Afghanistan. First, I wanted to thank you for your answer to Chairman Castro's question about diplomats being able to travel and risk-taking. We actually are working on a bill in that regard right now to try and make sure that our diplomats are able to get outside and actually talk to people and understand what's going on and take the necessary risks to do the job well. I wanted to ask you a little bit, kind of a meta question, let's say. I think we tend to do these big reviews and lessons learned. I have read many of your reports, but you know, we actually know that even though you have a lot of these great lessons, that there are a lot of needed reforms and lessons that haven't actually been implemented. And especially as we're seeing now, stabilization operations across Africa, particularly in the Sahel, that could use some reorientation and potentially are suffering from many of the same failures we're talking about today. Given your experience watching this process in Afghanistan, how do you think we should make sure we pivot before it's too late? In other words, what would actually be required to intervene in the interagency process, identify and communicate the failures, identify what needs to change, and make that come to fruition? Because it's clear to me that more money and more strategies and more oversight reports do not necessarily lead to this change. So what would and how can Congress be a partner on that?
Congresswoman, that is an excellent question, and you hit the nail on the head. And the answer is to look at the role of Congress. You control the purse strings. And doing oversight, and I used to work for one of the greatest chairmen in recent history, John Dingell. And he knew that oversight was what Congress should do, and this is bipartisan, nonpartisan oversight. And that means not just calling in the Secretary of State, but that means digging deeply and looking at particular programs. And Congressman, if you have allegations, if you have concerns about what we're doing in Africa or what we're doing in Haiti, then the chairman and the ranking member should work on getting your staff to start asking some tough questions. And don't end by just bringing in the Secretary of State. You can't require him to know everything. You have to find the people who are running that program. So ultimately, it's Congress's role. And if you don't get answers, don't fund the program. And I'm old school. I worked for almost 25 years in the Senate and the House. And it is the role of Congress to protect the taxpayer's purse. And it's through oversight and withholding funds and sending messages to certain errant bureaucrats. Bring them up. Hold people accountable, Congresswoman. Hold people accountable. All of the reports we've done, no one in the government has been held accountable. I always joke that the only person who's ever going to get fired over Afghanistan is probably going to be me. Nobody else. Not the generals who came up and spun and spun and spun, and the ambassadors and aid administrators who gave bogus data to you. None of them have held accountable. You have to hold people accountable, ma'am.
Okay, well, thank you. And my staff, if you're listening, sounds like we've got some work to do. I wanted to move on to the Global Fragility Act. I know in your latest DIGAR report, you talked about the lack of administrative capacity to carry out programs. And the Global Fragility Act right now dictates that no more than 5% can be spent on administrative expenses to ensure that, you know, the money's actually going to our partners and to assistance. But obviously, as you point out, capacity of our agencies to carry out their work is incredibly important. So what kind of investment in our capacity at both state and USAID do you believe is required for the GFA to be successful?
Yep. Is Natalie there?
I'm sorry, I'm hearing another question. Is it? I'm sorry.
Do we,
Somebody's
Sean, do we
speaking
know
over
when
your
the
number.
Nicole, I think you're
billion
not
or whatever the
muted.
hell it is going to be going, or they haven't made that determination yet? Or 64 million.
I think
64 million.
Steph, can you
everybody
mute
please
Nicole?
please mute themselves unless they're speaking.
I'm terribly sorry. I couldn't hear your questions, Congressman.
No, that's okay. I was asking about GFA and the 5% to administration and what you think actually would be required to be able to adequately implement GFA at state and aid.
You know, we haven't specifically looked at that issue, and I'm sorry, I can't answer that. I can have my staff look into it. We're just saying is that civilian agencies are going to be carrying out, which I think is a very important statute, but you're not giving them any more resources to do it. And we saw what happens when they're under-resourced in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I don't know what the number is, but I'm happy to get back to you and try to give you a number on that.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you so much. Thank you again for all your work. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Vice Chair. All right, Daryl Issa is next, but you don't have your video on, Daryl. I'll take 5 seconds to see if you're there. If not, Miss Tenney is next, but she's not on video either. All right, Ms. Houlihan, you're up.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Excellent, thanks. My questions have to do with the Taliban and particularly women. The Taliban are continuing to send a lot of mixed signals on whether women will be allowed to work or participate in social and economic activities, which of course directly impacts their ability of women and girls to access critical services and aid. So I was wondering if you could help me understand how can the United States and our international partners effectively or better engage the Taliban on principled humanitarian access, ensuring for the equitable distribution of humanitarian aid, particularly at this time when women and girls are confined to home due to insecurity and the Taliban's crackdowns?
That's a very good question, and unfortunately, I don't have a good answer. We've lost all ability, first of all, to really know how bad the situation is for women and girls, as well as a lot of other Afghans. But we also don't have much leverage. Now, the best thing I can say, Congresswoman, is we need to get the intel of what's going on. We can get that from the media that is there and other sources just to find out how good or how bad the Afghan Taliban are doing. We can't trust what they say. They're pretty good at PR this time around. But if we do any funding, and I'm not advocating that we give a dime to the Taliban government, so just know that. Remember, what do they want? And how do we ensure if we give them anything that they want, we get something in return? So I think it's going to have to be smart conditionality, strong conditionality, and we're going to have to be willing to say no if they're not living up to their commitments on a number of issues, including counterterrorism, human rights violations, etc. That's the best I can give you. We are in a very poor spot to try to help the women, the girls, and the average Afghans right now.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely keeps me up at night. And I'm going to ask my second question and hopefully have time to ask a follow-up to this one. Secretary Blinken testified before us last month, and he announced that the State Department would appoint a special envoy to focus on Afghan women's issues. How do we make sure that that role is effective, given what we've just been talking about? And how can the U.S. advance accountability mechanisms to prevent harm to women and girls in other conflict-affected contexts?
Well, I hope whoever they appoint is aggressive and savvy and has the ability to call upon all the resources of the United States government to find out what is going on. And also, I hope that when that person, whoever it is, has the ability then to brief the secretary and brief Congress on a regular basis on what the problem is and to work out the solution. I hope it's not window dressing. You know, there are many ambassadors floating around this country who I think are more window dressing than reality. So you want to make certain whoever that person is, Congress interviews him. Congress finds out what is his brief, what is his authorities, can he find out, and then what's he going to do with the information? So pull the thread. I think it's a great idea, special ambassador, just as long as the special ambassador does something and has the ability to do something.
And with the last waning seconds of my time, I'm wondering, you mentioned, don't give something without getting something in return. If for whatever reason we move forward with support or direct money to the Taliban-led government, what would be an example or two or three of what you would think of in terms of getting something in return?
Well, if they want to access, let's say, to the $8 billion we froze in the Federal Reserve, you would want to get an assurance that is verifiable by either U.S. government or an international body that they are respecting the rights of women. That means somebody on the ground with the ability, just like weapons inspectors we've used in the past. I remember when we gave money to the former Soviet Union right before the collapse and after the collapse, on nuclear proliferation and other issues. We required them, the Russians and the former Soviet Union, to allow GAO inspectors in. Now, Russia is not the same as Afghanistan. The Taliban aren't the same as the Kremlin, but that's the type of thing. Okay, you want our money? Then inspectors come along with it.
Thank
You
you,
remember
sir.
when we did the Marshall Plan, after World War II, we had somebody from the US government sitting in every office in France, Germany, Belgium, etc., to ensure that the money got spent. Now, that's the old days. You can do it with technology now a lot better than having somebody sit there. But you've got to have somebody out there to kick the tires who can actually independently determine if the Taliban are living up to their agreements.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Houlihan. Daryl Issa.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on the last round of questioning. I'd ask it in a sort of a negative way, but I think assertively. Isn't it true that when we left Afghanistan, we basically left 37 million people to the historic rule of the Taliban under Sharia law and a 6th century mentality?
Well, we left the Afghan people to the current Afghan government. So I can't say if it's all Sharia law, and I can't say 4th century, but the obvious is that we're not there and there is no Ghani government. So we left them to a government run by the Taliban.
But historically, that government, when they ran things the last time, did not respect what we would consider women's rights, or more specifically, they believed in women's rights that were so different than ours that we would call them inhumane. Women are taken out of school at a very early age. They're not going to get the kind of education that we're used to. There's a lot of those things that are just a given at this point, unless you assume that they have somehow changed their ways, which there seems to be no indication.
I have not seen any indication that they've changed their ways, other than they have better public relations. And again, Congressman Issa, I know you and I go back years when you were in the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Back then, as well as now, I have not met an Afghan woman who trusts the Taliban.
Now, your reports leading up to the collapse of the Afghan military predicted that that it would fold, that in fact it was not stable. Isn't that true?
Well, we predicted it was fold. We did not predict it would fold as fast as it did.
But if you predicted it would fold, then the decision to leave Afghanistan was by definition a decision to leave it to the Taliban and their interpretation of justice, law, and where the world should go, correct?
I can't say that was purpose of the decision or whatever.
Where your reports were run through the system, so they were seen by people at the highest levels of the State Department, correct?
All of our reports are public, and they have been public for as long as I've been there, so almost 10 years.
So is there any other conclusion one could reach when you say that it will inevitably collapse, but that we were going to leave the people, the 37 million people of Afghanistan, to the rule and control of the Taliban?
I wouldn't draw that conclusion. Our conclusions were more that the government or the military would probably collapse over a period of time. We didn't know who was going to replace it. The Taliban was out there. There could have been another government came in, non-Taliban, that replaced the Ghani regime, which was basically viewed as incompetent. So we didn't say Taliban is the next one in line.
Well,
we just
besides
said
right, but besides the Taliban and ISIS-K, is there a significant group that you could name that had a reasonable possibility from a military and government standpoint of taking control of Afghanistan?
Well, right now I wouldn't want to name them, but I think there were a number of warlords and other politicians and political groups that could have, and I think there was some evidence that they were planning to take over. Maybe not democratically, but they were. So there were a number of groups out there, I think, who were strong men, regional leaders that were looking to take over.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to participate in this subcommittee hearing, and to the rest of the subcommittee for allowing with the unanimous consent. And thank you, Mr. Sopko, for being here today. I spent late 2013 to mid 2015 in Afghanistan, flew in and out of Kabul's airport and saw those Italian G222s sitting there. Gathering dust, and then one day they were all in a pile of scrap metal. $549 million worth of investment gone down. And I appreciate your testimony and all of your reporting, which as my colleague Ms. Jacobs said, some of us were reading those. I guess you mentioned the need for Congress to reprise its oversight capabilities in this area, and I guess what do you attribute to the failure of Congress to really ask those tough questions, or even if those tough questions were being asked, for any action to have been taken on behalf of them over the past, 2 decades, but probably more acutely last decade?
Congressman, you're pulling me way beyond my brief. I do reconstruction. I don't, and in Afghanistan, I don't look at congressional foibles or prerogatives.
Understood, sir.
It's yeah. So, but I mean, when I retire, maybe I'll write a book about that. But I mean, it is difficult to change, and I think you appreciate this. Once you start a war, it is hard to change it. I mean, it is a slippery slope, and it keeps going down, down and down and down. And there are more and more people who are involved in it, and everybody thinks just one more cycle, just another year, another 6 months, we're going to turn the corner. That is the difficulty. It's the difficulty of changing a ship of state as it's moving down that river. How do you get it to turn? I mean, it's almost like we saw what happened when that big ship in the Suez just turned a little and it got stuck. That's the difficulty. But Congress has to do effective oversight. The IGs do, but by the time we get there, the body is dead and cold, and it's maybe removed, and all we got is a chalk outline of an audit or a program that's dead. You are there in the beginning. And the congressional committees have to do that. And it was President Wilson who said the role of oversight for Congress is as important, if not more important, than the role of legislating. So I'm biased toward the oversight.
I appreciate that. And I will direct this next question to be a little bit more within your scope. Obviously, you've gone through a litany of the failures that have been witnessed, of fraud, waste, abuse, mismanagement. You mentioned earlier the fuel surcharge and those kind of corruption components. We've seen other reports on the extent to which extortion rackets or security forces or security services, private security services, were essentially set up as ways of getting more money out of the U.S., creating security threats and then profiting from it. Did you ever, in your reporting, come at an estimate of how much of the Taliban's funding may have been through U.S. funds that were being either extorted or skimmed or bribed or otherwise?
I don't think we did. There were estimates, but I'm afraid to give them now because I think they could have been classified. But we assumed the Taliban got about a third of their money through either the corruption or counter or narcotics, and then a third through taxing and a third through donations. But that's the best I can say at this point. I can try to get back to you, Congressman, if you want, in the committee on that. but I'm afraid to go much further.
I appreciate that. And I want to end on a positive note. So your reports kind of showed many of the failures. At any time in your investigations and in your work, did you find success stories that you can share?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there were successes with healthcare. There were successes with education. There were successes with mortality rate among Afghans in general, not as much as it was exaggerated by the former administrator of USAID some time ago, but there were successes in all of those areas. The National Solidarity Program was a great success. I think some of the State Department programs supporting a free and independent media, there were small programs, they were a success. Some of the money, and again, these were small programs supporting civil society organizations, were a success. So there were successes, but overall, there were a lot of failures.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sopko, and I think we should learn from the successes and make sure we learn even more from the failures. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for joining us today. And we're going to go to a quick second round of questions, and I'm going to start off. And members, if you have questions, I don't want to call on folks if they don't have a question. So I know Ms. Jacobs has one, the Vice Chair has one. If you've got a question, then send me something in the chat if you can, or let our staff know, the subcommittee staff, and they'll let me know. So, Mr. Sopko, a few follow-up questions for you. You know, part of the charge of the mission of this committee is also on global corporate social impact. And I want to ask you your role or your assessment of U.S. companies and corporations in their work in Afghanistan. Defense contractors, of course, but other kinds of contractors that were used, any positive and negative impacts that they had. I know that you talked about the corruption in Afghanistan and the Afghan money and pilfering money and so forth. What role did U.S. contractors play in any of that? If you could speak to that as well.
Well, most, I can't come up with a number, but I would say most contractors, whether defense contractors, aid contractors, or whatever, did a good job or did as best the job they could with the contracts that were written. The problem with many of the contracts is that we really, and this was a government fault, we didn't hold the contractors accountable. And we also didn't specifically look to see if those contracts actually accomplished anything. And again, I urge the members to read our monitoring and evaluation, where, you know, it was the risk of doing the wrong thing perfectly. So we would give contracts to American contractors or foreign ones, and they did everything to the letter of the contract, but it accomplished nothing. That's not the contractor's fault. That's the fault of whoever wrote the contract.
Let me drill down for a second. Now, so you're saying that, I guess, military leaders or the administration, successive administrations, whether it may have been DOD or the State Department or USAID, that they alone came up with that mission? Were they influenced by these contractors at some point that were lobbying them to do certain things in Afghanistan? Or are you absolving those contractors any role in convincing them to go in a wayward direction?
Yeah, I'm not absolving some of the contractors. We indicted some and put them in jail. We just got a plea from somebody today on a contractor or subcontractor. I'm just saying that's, to me, it was the bigger problem, is contractors doing everything to meet the contract, but it didn't accomplish anything at the end. So that, to me, is a bigger waste. Now, there were contractors that did substandard work. Those were mainly a lot of subs that came in, and what happened is contracts were being sold from sub to sub to sub. The other thing is there were a lot of sole source contracts that did not follow the acquisition rules. That was a major problem, and that's where we saw a lot of problems. There were the contractors, like somebody mentioned, the G222. That was $400 to $500 million. For airplanes that didn't fly or didn't fly too well, and were basically turned into scrap. That was a situation where I believe the contractors did not live up to the contract and produced insufficient goods. I don't have an estimate one way or the other. I think you can read our reports on some of the major problems with contractors, but I don't like to paint all the contractors with one brush. That's the
Sure.
point I'm trying to make.
Sure.
Many of them did. Actually, many of the contractors, I don't say many, a number of contractors came to us and told us on the QT, this is ridiculous what they're asking us to do. We had
Sure.
contractors that came to us saying the timeline is totally ridiculous. I mean, we had the woman who provided those sexy white goats, Italian goats, that were flown in to, fool around with less sexy Afghan goats to produce mohair or whatever. The woman just went through the roof. This was ridiculous. There's no way you could do this in 6 months. It would take you at least 6 to 10 years. But I mean,
but who gets in like on that, right? Who
Yeah.
gets talked into that idea? Or does some administrator come up with that on their own? A bureaucrat comes up with that on their own? Because you're dealing with companies that have extensive as you know, you worked in Congress, have
Yeah.
extensive lobbying operations to convince people to do different things. So I'm wondering, do these administrators or bureaucrats just decide on their own to do this crazy stuff? Are they getting talked into some of that?
Well, in that case with our goats, she didn't have a lobbyist, that's for sure. She just, signed up for it, did it, and just quit in disgust. So I put that aside. We did not see any evidence of a lobbyist directing this. We looked for that, directing some stupid contract. We looked for it, but we didn't find that. So I can't attest that. It could have occurred. We didn't find it, so I can't answer it.
No, well, thank you. All right, I'm going to yield back the time, and I know that Representative Jacobs has questions, and then I think Representative Mayer after that will have a question. Vice Chair.
Well, thank you, and thanks for letting us do 2 rounds. I wanted to keep digging on this question of USAID contracting. I think that, you talked about how it's the contract and the contracting itself that's a problem. Could you talk a little bit about some of the impediments to changing contracts, and in particular, if there was a difference between how large NGOs and smaller NGOs were dealt with? In particular, we know smaller NGOs had a hard time working with USAID, but was there any evidence that those smaller NGOs were actually less impactful? Was this more of an administrative capacity? How can we improve USAID's ability to work with those smaller NGOs if they are, in fact, just as or more effective?
I would have to get back to you for more details on that. Overall, I think the successes we saw, the more important, I wouldn't say more important, but the more successful contracts were usually smaller, and usually smaller NGOs doing them. And I don't know if I can draw any conclusion from that. We did hear a lot of complaints by small NGOs that it was difficult for them to contract with USAID, but I don't have the particulars on that right now. I apologize. I can get back to you. Small actually was better. If my gut reaction, we don't have an audit on that, but spending a lot of money did not, and that was as you can see from our reports, that was a problem we saw. We thought if we could throw more money at the situation, it would improve. Now, there were also some small subcontractors or contractors who did a horrible job. But there are some major contractors. I mean, some of these issues, I can talk about the rule of law program, an important program. But, I saw so much, and I don't know if these were big contractors or small contractors, where it looked like it was, a tourism job or program for lawyers in the ABA. So I would end up having to talk to lawyers coming in on this rule of law program who couldn't spell Afghanistan, who had no concept of the culture and the law they were doing it. But they were being paid by, I don't know if it was a major contractor or a subcontractor, to fly over to Afghanistan for a couple weeks or a month to talk of old war stories about how they were a prosecutor or defense attorney, or they did corporate work for AT&T, which has no relevancy to Afghanistan. Now, I can't tell you who brought them over, but we kept running into them. Likewise, we saw major contractors. The Promote program was a real boneheaded program, to be very blunt, where they were hiring people because they had to show success immediately. That was some major contractors. They were hiring kids off the street whose only qualification was that they were a carbon life form and breathing. They didn't know anything about women's issues. And I had Mrs. Ghani even tell me that. You created this program in which to enter it, you had to be a high school graduate. And she said, by definition, that eliminated 90% of the women in Afghanistan. And you, as the aid administrator, was saying this is going to be the greatest successful program for women in the history of the United States. I mean, Mrs. Ghani quit in disgust from even talking to those people. So I can't tell you, that was a large contractor. I don't know who it was, but they were so desperate. They just were hiring college kids.
Well, actually, can I jump in and ask a follow-up on this question? You know, I think part of this, as we have sort of talked about before, is that we had folks who didn't really understand the context of Afghanistan and what they were working on, in part because of the rapid turnover of civilian and military staff. As you know, Afghanistan, people say 1 year versus 2 or 3. That's typical of a FSO rotation. How legitimate is the concern of the risk of clientitis, and how do we go about balancing that with our need for our folks to actually be understanding and experts in the countries they're serving, so we don't keep making these mistakes?
Well, you have to write it into the contract, make certain these people have some knowledge, and somebody who's reviewing the contract should insist, and this goes back to monitoring and evaluation, that it sounds logical for a country like Afghanistan or like a country like Haiti. I think you asked the question before, maybe some other member, about, is this going on in Africa and other places? It very well could. And that's what my staff tells me, who produced that lessons learned report, because we're not writing good contracts. The government is a horrible organization for writing contracts. And this is what I've said before. It's not that the people in Afghanistan who worked for the US government were evil or bad or stupid. We gave them a box of broken tools. And I've used that term before, and that's what we did. Our contracting authority is broken. Our HR program is broken. Our appropriation cycle is broken. How we reward people in the government is broken. You need to fix that. I mean, I had contracting officers who repeatedly told me, the only thing I'm judged on is how much money I put on contract, not whether any of the contracts work. And by the time my tour is done, I don't even care if they work or not. You're gone. You don't stick around long enough to be held accountable. That needs to be fixed. And you need to look at what's going on in Africa and around the world with aid contracting and state contracting and DOD contracting right now. It could be just as bad, but I don't know. That's not my job to look at USAID outside of Afghanistan.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. We've got a lot of work to do on this committee, and I will yield back.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And Mr. Sopko and committee members, that concludes our questions. Mr. Sopko, first of all, thank you for all of your years of hard work and earnest examination and analysis of both our successes and our failures in Afghanistan. And we absolutely heed your advice and your warning about being aggressive in our oversight. And so thank you for everything. And you still have your job there, so you haven't, they haven't fired you. You joked you would be the only one that got fired. You still have your job, which is good. We're glad for that. And again, just want to say thank you for being with us.
Thank you. And if we can help you at all, Mr. Chairman, don't hesitate to call us. We're here to help.
Thank you. Absolutely. And that concludes our hearing, and we will adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you.